Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Virtual Herbalism Conference. I'm your host, Lindsay Feldposh, and I am so pleased to be welcoming our guest, Asia Suler. As many of you may know, Asia is a writer, a teacher, an herbalist, and an intuitive plant person with a deep connection to the natural world. Asia's work guides people into nature connection and plant relationships to co-create a connection. Asia has over a decade of sharing her transformative teachings with the world. Her best-selling book, Mirrors in the Earth, reflects her commitment to the plants and the hope for a vibrant, aligned life for all. In this discussion, Green Whispers and Wisdom, Soul Lessons from Plant Encounters, Asia will share her insights on plant communications and the lessons that we can learn from listening to the whispers of nature. We'll discuss how you can practice your listening skills and the tools that can support your path to these great plant connections. Welcome, Asia.
Thank you for that beautiful intro, Lindsay.
Thank you for joining us today. We're so happy to have you.
I'm like really excited to be back. This is such an amazing event. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah. Well, let's dive right in. I'm going to ask you a question, Asia, that is harkening back to the first soul lesson that you remember receiving from a plant.
Yeah, I love this question. Was so fun to think about. And I went all the way back. So all the way back to childhood for me is where this really started. And I mentioned sometimes in interviews that I didn't have a very nature-based childhood. I wasn't like exposed to herbalism or ecology or anything like that as a kid, but we had this willow tree that was planted in our backyard. I grew up in a duplex in a development, and we had these little postage stamp backyards. And when I was born, my father and grandfather planted this willow tree. And it really was like convenient for where we lived because it was, a place where that would experience a lot of flooding and, sort of water would build up there. They basically took like this lowland and put a development there. And so we would get like water that would basically like turn into this sort of pool in the empty space behind the houses. And so the willow tree like loved it there. It like flourished. It was this beautiful weeping willow, and that weeping willow became one of my best friends. And I have so many memories of like getting home from school and feeling so like just out of place and discombobulated and like self-conscious and just like parting the branches of this willow and going into the heart of this tree and climbing up into her branches with my journal and sitting there and in particular, like the times that really stand out for me was, when I was in late elementary school and I was a pretty early bloomer. I was like the tallest kid in my whole grade. And I remember like very vivid memory of like laying in her branches with my journal and just like speaking my heart out, like all the stuff that went down that day, all the ways in which I felt so out of step and out of place. And the message that came back for me really strongly in that moment, I could hear her say this was, it's okay to not be like everybody else. And I think that like especially when you're super young like that, there's just like there's so much pressure, right, to like fit in and be normal and like just not stick out. And coming from her, it just meant so much to me, especially because like in the expanse of this like postage stamp backyard universe, like she stood out, you know? But like she stood out in this way that was like so beautiful, actually. Like all the neighborhood kids would come over and we would play there, and just like it was such a magical kingdom for all of us. And I, during the day when I was at school and I would be feeling just like really uncomfortable in my own skin, I would think about that message that I received from her. And yeah, just that was really what kicked it off for me, this practice of like speaking to plants, of bringing my whole self there, and of recognizing that there was wisdom that they had to share with me.
That is such a powerful story, Asia, especially with your connection to the tree and it being planted when you were born, and then that carried over to, even one willow apothecary, right? Is the name of your apothecary?
Yeah. Yeah, I named one willow for that willow tree that was planted when I was born.
It's really beautiful. So when you experienced that communication, what form did it come in? And how do you think that we as humans can experience plant communication? And do you think that everyone has the capacity to hear these whispers and plant wisdoms?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I really believe that this is our birthright as human beings, that we would not be alive if we didn't know how to speak with and communicate with plants, that this is like an essential part of all of our ancestral wisdom and knowledge, and that it's something that I think just is innate to our psyches, to our nervous systems. I think that we have overlays growing up, including sort of this cultural story that plants aren't alive, that plants aren't sentient, that plants aren't conscious. And that can block our ability to communicate. But what I've seen over and over again is that once you start leaning in again, it just starts happening. It's actually not that hard to undo any of these blocking patterns or conditioning, because it's just so innate and essential to who we are as human beings. And I often bring up the idea of the clairs. So clairs is the term is about clarity. It's about like clear knowing, clear seeing. And so the different clairs correspond to how you receive information in sort of a super sensory kind of way. So a lot of people are familiar with clairvoyant, like you know something because you see it, right? Like people who actually have visions or see auras around plants. A lot of times people who are clairvoyant might have really strong dreams even, or just strong daydreams. Then clairaudient is you know something because you like hear something. That could be like literally hearing a plant speaking to you. It could be having a song come on the radio at just the right time, or a song come into your head to sing. These are all ways to be clairaudient. I tend to be very clairsentient and claircognizant. So clairsentient is you know something because you feel it. Like you literally have like, feelings, sensations, emotions come up within you. A lot of people, especially sensitives, I find are clairsentient. And because we're people who tend to have a lot of big emotions from a young age, we might have also learned how to like curtail or curate those emotions. So a big part of this journey sometimes is also learning how to like really read your feelings again and let your feelings be there and know that they're containing information. And then claircognizant is you know something because it's almost like a download, like you just sort of receive almost like a packaged understanding in your head. And so if you've ever had like an aha moment, that's claircognizance. And so I mention this because everyone's going to receive in different ways from the plants, depending on where your sort of natural strengths are and how you receive information and receive clarity in your life. But these two, the clairsentient and the claircognizant, are ones that often people write off and don't realize that that is a very legitimate way to receive this information and these messages from the plants. So, when you are sitting with a plant, don't disregard a feeling that comes up inside your body. Don't disregard like a random sentence that might plop into your head, or, something that just feels like an aha moment or a download about your life, because that might be the way in which you are receiving what the plant has to share. And I think it's like really helpful when talking about speaking with plants or communicating with plants to describe like how this feels in the body. So I'll talk about how it feels like in my body, that when messages come through from plants, no matter how they're coming through, there's often this sense of peace, neutrality, non-judgment, curiosity, and non-attachment. So, I think is true with any intuitive downloads that we receive, or intuitive information. But I also think plants are just really naturally in alignment with this wavelength, that they exist on this wavelength of like peaceful neutrality and non-judgment. And so really like looking for those feelings, looking for a feeling of like settledness and expansiveness and flexibility inside of your body. And so those will be good like hints or tips or tools to help you orient to these messages that are coming through.
I love having names for the different ways of hearing or listening to plants, Asia. I wonder if you have experienced or are hearing any of collective lessons that are coming from plants. And is there any way that they're trying to guide us as a collective?
Mm. Yeah, one thing that I'm really hearing strongly from the plants right now is I think it's a lesson that is super helpful for all of us, but especially any of us who feel sort of like stuck in our lives or stuck in this period of time. So there's a big message for me coming in around making peace and finding acceptance around where we are personally in our lives, but also in this like collective time on this planet. Plants can't move in the way we can move. Like if a seed lands in a particular place and that place has the conditions for the plant to grow, that plant will grow and that plant can grow there. And, of course, plants have different ways of, migrating, traveling, seed dispersal, all of that. But, in a plant's individual life, it will often be spent in that one singular place. And and so they are, in this way, plants are really masters at learning how to bloom where they're planted. They're masters at learning how to make peace with, sort of the hand that they've been dealt of where they are in the world, what's available to them in that moment. And so it feels like a really important message for us at this time on the planet where it seems like we keep coming up against these like crises of becoming, where many of us sort of long for a different kind of life, wish that we had sprouted in different soil, in a different place at a different time. That, there's this really big, profound lesson around coming to a space of peace and acceptance for where we are right now and where you are. And knowing too that I think there's a big story that a lot of us have, that that the sort of the lack of what we received, maybe the lack of like nourishment, or the lack of like ideal growing conditions that we received, that are the things that like happened to us in our life, that they've kind of like damaged us beyond repair. And like plants will literally show you, if you watch as they move through their life, and stuff happens to them too. Windstorms move through, they get munched down by a deer. That like all of these things just is just a part of your growth. And it's a part of the story of your growing and unfurling and your growth pattern. And that ultimately there is a way for you to flourish exactly where you are. There's a way to flourish with the exact hand that you have been dealt, the ground where you sprouted from, and that you're growing on this earth at this time for a reason. Because I think that like especially when we look around at the reality of like hardship and change and intergenerational trauma, it can feel like why am I even here in this like scant bare soil where it feels like it's like so hard to bloom, where I'm doing so much work on behalf of like my lineage and my culture. And I think that there's a really strong message here from the plants that like you are here on this earth for a reason. It's not an accident. Where you are isn't an accident. Like plants not only come in and like bloom in all different kinds of niches, but then even in the places where it's, difficult for life to take root, plants can come in and create more life there. They create soil, they create potential, they create diversity in food and all of that. And like we also have the ability to do that. Like when we can touch and access those spaces of peace and acceptance within our lives and within where we are in our lives, and to know that it really is not about the destination. It's about us being companioning ourselves, being with ourselves as we unfurl. And I just think plants are such amazing teachers in that regard.
Do you know what I love most about this message, Asia? I feel like we live in this time of great anxiety for so many reasons, and there's reality within that experience. But this message is one that feels so calming to that like global anxiety in many ways, and one that I think many of us need to hear.
Mm.
So, when you're hearing these messages and receiving these lessons from plants, I would love to hear how you differentiate from your own intuition and the projections that we sometimes create upon the world. And if you have any like personal checks that help you stay grounded in learning these communications.
Yeah, this is such a good question. And it's one that comes up a lot, right? Because we want to know, we want to have these checks, we want to like make sure that we're not getting in our own way, basically, is what it comes down to. And so there's two things that I do ask myself. And one is like when I receive something, how activated am I and how attached am I? So projection will bring up both of those things. Like I will be very activated in my nervous system. For me, that often looks like, my heart is racing. I have tension. So I might have like tension in my neck or my shoulders. My breathing won't be very expansive. So those are some checks for me of like, am I activated or not? I often won't be in the present moment. I'll be like, thinking about something from the past or figuring out projecting into the future, like how I can implement this. And then like how attached am I? Like, do I have like a really big sense of like, if I don't do this or if I don't like, follow this guidance, whatever it is, like this or this or this is going to happen, or like this must be some sort of way. So how activated am I and how attached am I? Projection will bring up both of those things very strongly. Intuition doesn't necessarily have either. So intuition often comes in with a sense of calmness and neutrality about it. It's kind of like, hey, it's like being at a potluck. It's like, hey, here's an option. You could eat it or not, and like intuition comes in with that, like kind of just like yeah, almost like tricksterish, like curiosity and openness to life. It's very now moment focused. It's not so much like, oh yeah, this is the right thing to do because I'm analyzing based on the past or the future. It's just like in this moment, this occurred to me, and it's actually bringing me deeper into the present moment through realizing it. And I know in general, like if a message comes in with any sense of judgment, rigidity, fear, urgency, or anxiety, that it's projection. And, this is very normal. This is like our brain likes to do this. Our brain really likes control. And so, like, this happens to all of us, that we are going to have this come up from time to time. It doesn't mean that you're not connected and don't have this ability, or that you're not spiritual enough. That's not true at all. It's just how our brain works. And so, having these two things where you're checking yourself, for these signs of activation or attachment, asking yourself, these questions of like, am I contracted or am I expanded right now? Am I centered? Or do I feel like I'm like leaning in or off center or leaning back in any way? Do I feel flexible and open? Or do I feel rigid? And so, all of these things I think are very helpful. And oftentimes, if I do have something that comes in that's a projection, what I often notice is that there actually is a message underneath that, but that I'm being asked to like look at the projection first. And the easiest thing for me there is just to like take a break, like especially if I get really like I need a message now, like which like bless my heart, we all have times like that. But like to just take a break from the intensity, right, of like my asking or my yearning or my longing, And like just sit with what is coming up for me in my body, literally breathe into the sensations of my body, notice what I'm feeling, notice if there's any emotions come up. And if I just take that time to sit with my body and step back to a place of greater regulation, whether that takes me 5 minutes or whether that takes me a few days, then often I can come back and be like, oh, okay. So this was actually what was going on underneath that projection, but the projection in part was coming up because this is important for me to look at. And this is part of why we project, right? We project because we're trying to know ourselves and to undo our patterns. And so it's not a bad thing when this comes up. It's just good to know how to recognize it and work with it so that ultimately we can, those projections can be seen in the way they want to be seen and sort of relax so that we can then receive like a wider field of knowledge.
I think that we sometimes can get in our own ways, right? This is almost a clearing of that. When I have received messages in the past, they always feel like they're coming through on a clearer channel, like it's the static is reduced. So,
Mm, I love that description.
yeah, sometimes our brains are always going, there's so much happening and feelings in our bodies. And then there's been moments where it's just like, oh, I needed to hear that and it came through.
Mhm.
So, I want to ask you, Asia, if there are any plants that you like to work with to tune into your listening skills.
Mm. So one of my favorite plants for this is Tulsi. And if anyone's like walked with me for a while, I like talk about Tulsi a lot because I just love this plant so much. And it's like all of its indications are just so profoundly helpful, I think, for like listening. So the way in which it actually like sharpens and clears the mind, it like increases our cognitive ability. It lowers and reduces anxiety and stress. So sometimes it's like not even about that moment, but it's what we're carrying into that moment or where we're coming from in that moment. Tulsi has a really long history of use as a sacred herb, as an herb that is like connected to the sacred, connected to visioning, connected to, sort of moments of peaceful, calm, clarity, and balance. And so, I'm a big proponent of Tulsi in any form, but I particularly love Tulsi tea. So that's like a big one that I'll do is I'll drink Tulsi tea like before I might go into a session where I'm asking to receive wisdom, where I'm sort of clearing my mind out of the things that like clog the ducts kind of. And also it's just I find it so settling for the digestive system and for my nervous system that sometimes if I'm also walking into a session where I just have body stuff up, like my tummy hurts or like, I'm just like carrying stress that it helps like clear that away so that the channel gets wider.
Beautiful. Definitely a fan of Tulsi. And there's a reason why it is such a sacred plant. Um, Asia, I want to hear how you braid science and ecology with relational and spiritual practices with plants.
I love this question because I was not a science kid growing up, like at all. And I look back on it, and there was like moments in certain classes, but I look back on it and I'm like, oh, if my teachers had brought in like relational meaning making into these disciplines, I would have loved them. And so for now as an adult, like braiding them together is like one of my absolute favorite things. And it's because, as someone who, grew up in the Western world, science and ecology are the languages of wonder that we have inherited. And so to me, it's like wonder is literally like that which like opens our mind, right? It opens our mind to like greater perspectives, to magic, to possibility. And so I really think like relational and spiritual practice and science and ecology go hand in hand. And especially for those of us who lean sort of naturally a little more in like the spiritual realms or like the creative or emotional realms, going into science and ecology can really help confirm for us what we're receiving. It also helps to give us safety checks, right? To literally help us feel safe, following some of the intuitions, the through lines of intuition that we are receiving. This is like a big reason why I went to herbal school in the first place in my early 20s is I knew I wanted to work with plants and I knew I wanted to work with people. And I also knew that I wanted that safety check of like knowing, disease process and plant constituents and all of that. And so it gave me this sort of like strength and security to follow my intuition more because I knew that I had that background. And I think in a lot of traditional contexts, if you're growing up in a space where there is a lot of intact herbal knowledge, you are automatically experiencing this kind of braiding because you're receiving sort of the collected wisdom and body of knowledge that your culture system has developed at the same time that you were encouraged to lean into your own intuitive knowing and your own relationship with the plants. And so we're kind of like rebuilding that right now in the Western world. And for those of us who have disrupted lineages of plant wisdom and knowledge, and because we're not necessarily coming from these like intact cultures of relational and ecological knowledge, like we're learning as adults. We are like rebraiding that. And to me, the rebraiding of those things together is what is going to create a more intact body of wisdom to pass on to the coming generations. And so I think we need both. And I know that, for example, when we pass on wisdom, especially in like an oral storytelling capacity, that wisdom is remembered so much more strongly and for such a longer period of time if it is connected to story, if it is relational, and if it has meaning for that person's life. And so a lot of the work that I see people doing now and that I feel very passionate about in my life of like, yeah, braiding the science and the ecology with the spiritual knowing and the relational knowledge that comes up just through being in relationship, that this is actually how we create a body of wisdom that has longevity through the generations.
I love that so much, Asia. There's so many beautiful ways in which science and indigenous knowledge are intertwined. And I feel like putting them together is such a beautiful way to experience the world. And I think, braiding sweetgrass with Ravenwell Kimmerer's book is one of the best ways. And I love that braiding has come up so much in this. And there's another book called The Spoke the Plant by Monica Gagliano, and it's science and it's spirituality and it's the proving of both to be intertwined. And I love that so much. So thank you for sharing. I would love to ask you, what are the lessons that you feel we need to hear in regards to everyday reciprocity with plants? And what does this look like for you in your life?
Well, I love that you brought this up and that we're talking about reciprocity and how essential this is and at the heart of existence. I recently finished Robin Wall Kimmerer's new book, The Service Berry, and I mean, this is just so much of what that book is about. It's about how like reciprocity creates relationship, and like relationship is what all of life is built on. And I think what I see the most in my audience and the people that I work with is a large majority of us are sensitives. And so what I often see is not this paradigm where people aren't wanting to give back or don't think plants give us enough, but actually like this different paradigm where there's like this anxiety and concern that plants give us so much that it feels overwhelming to know how to return the favor. And one of the things that I really like to, share with folks when that comes up for them is that I don't think in my humble perspective that plants are expecting us to give to them in the way that they give to us. It actually would be pretty impossible because our lives are literally built on the fact of their presence, and the same is not true for plants. Like they don't need us in the way that we need them. And yeah, what I really hear from the plants is that, just thinking about the fact that plants give to us, food, shelter, air, just by being their natural, effortless selves. And that there's this level, and this is actually what the world is asking for us in our own reciprocity. And so, it's one of those things where it's like, it's a whole lifetime of work just to be yourself, but it's also the most effortless thing of all. It's like this dichotomy. But, I see when this anxiety comes up around like, how do I give back? That it's not about actually like fitting yourself in a particular mold of like, well, I need to become someone who like plants orchards, or whatever it is. But that actually there's a way through which stepping more into your natural self, you will find the ways in which it makes the most sense for you to give back. Whether that's, writing letters to your representative or educating people about climate science, like whatever it is that comes through for you, making flower essences and giving them to your neighbors. So, I think there's this piece where reciprocity, it is an important practical action. Like the practicality is helps us bring us into relationship and into the moment, but it's really more of a heart energy than an actual motion. So like if you've ever received a gift, for example, that like kind of has strings attached to it, like what I mean, where you're like, that didn't feel like reciprocity, that felt like pressure and like something was being asked of me. And so from my perspective, any outward movement of reciprocity, whether that's singing to a plant or, giving a plant water, planting seeds, as I mentioned, taking political action, that any of these things should simply be an extension of what you're already feeling in your heart. And I think that in a lot of ways, this is how we heal the world. Like just coming back into this heart-centered reciprocity, moving from that space. And that's ultimately what creates real relationship, is that reciprocity that like comes from our hearts, comes from being our natural selves. And when we are in our heart in that way, we naturally just start thinking in terms of relationships and community, of like, not just, what benefits me in this exact moment, but what benefits the whole. And, like what are all of us needing in relationship with one another. And I think, learning how to develop reciprocity with plants, especially coming from, in my background, a culture where plants were kind of just there, they weren't, we weren't thanking them, we weren't giving gratitude for them, but learning how to like access in our heart this sense of gratitude, and naturally from there, moving from the space of reciprocity, I really think it's like that heart energy that the plants are so nourished by receiving, and that just automatically creates relationships and communities of care.
That's such a beautiful message. It makes me feel like if we're living in harmony with ourselves, it's easier to live in harmony with others and the world around us. And, when we're experiencing dissonance in ourselves, in our heart space or in our environment, it's hard to, create that or be on that wavelength. So of reciprocity. Asia, I wonder if you have any other plant communications that are coming in that are surrounding collective grief and climate anxiety. We touched a little bit about this in your earlier messaging, but I would love to hear if you have any other words to share.
Yeah. Grief is a really, it's important. It's an important feeling, and it's important to feel. And there's this level where we know from like a neuroscientific perspective that grieving, it's a process of learning. It's a process of recreating the maps inside of our brain, of helping us to bring us new information, to orient to new environments. This is part of like the neurological gift of grieving. And grieving shows us that, it shows us how deeply we loved. It shows us how deeply something was precious to us. And so, with actually embracing grief, we are helping to rewrite the maps of existence that we have been handed. Like we literally know that when we lose a loved one, the research has specifically been done on people who've passed, but that when we lose a loved one, part of what makes the grief so disorienting and it's such an intense brain experience is that we map our world based on relationships. And so when a relationship changes, we have to rewrite the whole map. And that's a really big process. And grieving is the process that helps us do that rewriting. And so grieving the world and being in our grief is actually a really important thing to feel, to be with, to allow to move through you. And this is the thing about grief is when it moves through us, it's able to do its work of rewriting the landscape and the map so that we can orient to what is and really show up to be like active agents of change in this world. And to me, like grief and anxiety are a little bit different. And so from my perspective, the feeling of anxiety often comes up when we're not able to feel the full range of our feelings. That it's too overwhelming to feel the full range of our feelings. So to feel the grief or to feel the rage or to feel the despondency. And it makes sense when that comes up. And anytime I have anxiety come up in my body, I often ask myself, what is the feeling underneath this? Because there's a level in which anxiety isn't actually its own feeling, right? It's in reaction to the groundswell of feelings within me. And so I think that this is like a big piece around what the world is asking of us and what the plants are asking of us is to feel our feelings. Like human beings, we have big feelings. It's like part of our landscape. And I really think like human emotion it's a pretty precious thing. It's like a weather unto itself. And there's this ways in which like the climate crisis that we're in a lot of ways like has come about from humans who have not been able to feel their full emotions, right? Like, whatever it is, like, creating these, you know, outward goals in their life that they think will bring them, like the peace or the belonging that they seek. But really it comes down to like not being comfortable sitting with their feelings, to sit with the weather patterns inside of themselves. And so I actually think it's like a huge service to the world to feel your grief around what is happening, to feel your rage, to let those feelings actually have the processes that they're here to ignite within us. Like grief, as I said, it's a process of learning and reorientation. Rage is so good at helping us get clear, at helping us like understand where the boundaries are, knowing what we need to protect and what's important. And so we are going to have big feelings come up right now because of how deeply we love and care for this planet, for our communities, for our own lives. And it's a good thing to have come up. It's a good thing to feel. And at the same time, it's okay to know that, there's moments where it might feel too overwhelming, whether it is just like, this is like, I feel responsible for the entire world. And like to remember that, like, actually, being asked to be responsible for right now is the weather that's moving through you and the way that that will open up these channels of possibility in which you can like plug in and create change in this world. And I think there is this level in which, and this might not be like a popular thing for me to say, but I think there's this level in which plants are at peace with what is. And I'm not saying that plants are like being like condoning climate change or anything like that, but I just think the way that plants live, they live in the moment. And they, like the earth, are just always orienting towards growth and, not dwelling in the past, not projecting into the future. And, the plant kingdom has lived through many cataclysms on our planet. And this is another earth created cataclysm because we are part of the earth. And as much as we sometimes like, are super down on ourselves and think that we're like somehow separate and like somehow this like really destructive force that is like anti-life and anti-earth. Like we are life and we are earth. And so this is another cataclysm in the long story of the earth and in the long story of the plant kingdom that they are living through. And I really think that like when there's a deeper meta message here in terms of us being with the inner weather patterns inside of ourselves and like allowing that to be the thing that ultimately is able to like shift our interaction with the world. And, you know, plants have survived many different iterations of weather patterns and catastrophe. And I really believe that we have the ability to as well. And so there will be like gems of learning that come out of this cataclysm, not only for us, but for the whole world. And I really think for the soul of the earth, like there's a bigger story being played out here that we don't have access to in our little human consciousnesses. And like that's okay, but all we're being asked to do right now is to like be with the beauty actually of the feelings that are moving through us because that's what opens us up to meeting these times that are to come.
The zooming out, Asia, of your message and this kind of bigger picture take really makes me feel like a sense of peace and calm about the times we're living in. So thank you. I'm sure
Mhm.
this and much more kind of guides your sense of consent and boundaries when you're working with plants and places. How do you utilize the communications from plants and this feeling that you've espoused, like when working to harvest or engage with plants and as an herbalist?
Yeah, plants have so much to teach us about boundaries. You know, consent and boundaries, this is like essential to existence. Like we come here to be in bodies, be individuals, to have things that, are just ours, to learn what it's like to individuate. And so like boundaries and therefore consent is a huge part of this. And if we look at what's happening around the world, it's like boundaries are at the heart of climate crisis and human issues. And why is this? Well, boundaries are also at the heart of trauma. Boundary violations are at the heart of trauma, and that's something that we are dealing with en masse in our world and the human psyche. And so there's this way in which learning how to listen to the plants and hear and honor their boundaries is such a powerful training ground for us, especially because from a young age, a lot of us were kind of handed this paradigm of like, the world is ours for the taking, like I can shred all the leaves off this branch and it doesn't matter, or like dig up this plant just because I feel like it in this moment. And, it's the paradigm that many of us grew up in. And so when we actually are able to orient to plants as sentient conscious beings who have their own boundaries, then it really like rewrites the way we see ourselves in the world, the way we see how boundaries actually create much deeper relationship. Like when we can honor other beings' boundaries, that being then feels safe relating with us. And so we can create like so much deeper relationship and connection because there's that safety to be sharing and to be in exchange. So with plants in particular, because they have their own ways of communicating. They're not humans, so they're not necessarily gonna say something out loud or push us away or different ways that like humans communicate boundaries. But one of the things that I find is really helpful is to learn like how a no feels in your body when you're receiving a no from a plant. And you can practice this with, asking someone to say no to you in your life. And it helps in particular when you ask someone and it doesn't just like come up because sometimes we can have a whole like layer of triggers come up when someone says no to us about something. But to be like, okay, we're going to practice. I'm going to ask you for something and you're going to say no. And then I'm going to witness like what I feel in my body. And so the more you can practice like witnessing what you feel in your body when you're receiving a no, the more you'll be able to hear, when a plant says no. And my experience when plants say no, that there's not like anger or, a sense of like the plant being punitive. It's just a firmness. It's just a reality of existence. Like, no, I don't want that. Or like, no, not that leaf, or no, not that plant. So for me, the way this often shows up when I ask plants for permission to gather them or to pick a flower or to make a flower essence, I will, if it's a no, I might sometimes like hear a no, but more often I'll feel in my body like a sense of contraction, hesitation, or questioning. And if there's questioning, then it's not a full yes. And so to take a moment there to just like step back, and then normally I'll pose another question. So if it's like, if it's not this plant, could it be this plant? Or if it's not, these leaves, could it be these leaves? And normally what I experience is if I feel drawn to harvest a plant or, ask a plant to become a part of my medicine, then normally it's not going to be a no across the board, but I'll get specific no's about specific plants or specific flowers. I also, if you have the sort of due diligence where you're like checking populations and you're seeing like, how many plants are growing in a given area, if you know what the rare or endemic species are, then you're already kind of going in with a little bit of like this baseline knowledge of what is appropriate and what is not. And that can really help too. And, at the end of the day, like learning how to acknowledge the no and say no, it's amazing how that can, like, how much that can free you. And I think a big part of this is because the price of a boundary violation is the loss of connection. And so this happens on an individual basis between us and a person, a human, or us and a plant. But I think it's also happened en masse, in our world, is that, on a cultural or societal level, when we have not been acknowledging the natural innate boundaries that exist in the more than human world, then we lose connection. And so especially if your goal, right, is to come into deeper and deeper states of connection with the living world, it's you should actually be excited about getting a no, because then it gives you that opportunity to build that connection and build that deeper relationship.
I love that, Asia. There's been so many times where I see us herbalists teaching students or, people who are new to the practice about like asking a plant if they can harvest. And never before have I ever seen this like practical offering of, practice what no feels like in your body and then recognize it for what it is in communication with a plant. So I find that so valuable. So we live in a world where there is great biodiversity and access to nature, being both in Appalachia, but many of our listeners probably have less access to nature and the encounters that they offer. Do you have any accessible ways for folks out there in that position to cultivate plant relationships?
hmm Yeah. So my love of plants really exploded and deepened in an exponential way when I lived in New York City. And so this is like a topic that's really near and dear to my heart, because not only do I think it's possible to connect with plants when you're living in an urban landscape, I actually think that there's like a huge potential there for connection and for a relationship. So I want to name a couple things that I thought was really profound and helpful for me. And at the same time, I also want to name that my experience is that plants in more urban spaces are so excited to connect. They're so excited because they see, like, literally you and the other humans make up a huge part of the ecology in which they live. And like imagine being a part of an ecology where like the vast majority of the beings in that place aren't acknowledging you, aren't interacting with you. So it's actually like I find that the plants get like hugely excited when you do interact with them in an urban landscape. So you actually have like such a precious opportunity to make some really powerful connections. So the easiest way to make a direct connection to a plant, like, and to to like really have a profound relationship is to just like grow a plant in a pot. Literally on your windowsill, get a plant, grow it in a pot. Like if there's a plant you want to learn about that you can grow, like put that plant in a pot. Even if that plant doesn't make it past a certain stage, you will learn so much about that plant through cultivating and tending that plant. I had like a little tiny little backyard when I lived in Brooklyn. And we planted a little garden back there. It was like a Liberty Garden. From World War II, we dug it up and dug up all these old bricks, and we ended up, planting all these plants there. And like I didn't know anything about really at that time taking care of gardens, so I wasn't pruning anything. I wasn't deadheading anything. Like everything basically grew like leggy and wild and went to seed by like mid-July. But I learned so much in that process. And there's just this sense of when you grow a plant in a city, even if it's just a common house plant or an orchid that you bring into your house, that you are bringing so much beauty into that space. It really like ripples out around you. So that's a big one for me. Any way in which you can to like actually be in presence with a plant, including growing that plant. I also really love making offerings to plants in public spaces. And this is one that can be like edgy for people because you're like, I don't want to be seen like hugging a tree. But here's what's really cool about it is oftentimes the plants that, are kind of like the gatekeeper plants for that landscape. There's this concept of gatekeeper plants that are the prominent. Normally, it's often trees, but depending on where you are, maybe you don't grow up, or maybe you're not living in a place where there's trees, but there might be, like a prominent bush or a prominent vine, but, a prominent cactus. But to go to that gatekeeper plant, and oftentimes that plant will be very obvious in the landscape. Other people will be drawn to it. So I would go and like leave offerings by big trees in the park. And what's really cool when you do this is other people will get so interested. Like people will stop you and be like, "What are you doing?" Like this is super interesting and cool. Maybe you're like leaving flowers or, whatever it is, maybe singing a song, leaving water. As long as your offering is like biodegradable, it's all welcome. And and people will get really interested in it. And then even after you leave, especially if it's something that's visible, like people will be drawn to it. They will come, they'll participate in it. And so not only are you then giving back and then receiving the connection that comes through like acknowledging this being, but you're also creating this ground for even more connection in that space, which is really special and a really cool thing to do. I also always encourage people to notice the weeds. So everywhere you are in this world, there's going to be like, wild ones who grow in. And so in New York City, it's like the cracks of the pavement. We have dandelions cropping up. Or I remember this one time, walking down the street in Williamsburg was this gorgeous datura plant. And I'm like, oh my God, like, but to even just noticing them, you don't even have to stop or notice them and send them love. And they will absolutely beam back to you. Like it's one of the coolest experiences that I've had is like these incredible warriors basically coming into this landscape and like bringing life back to this landscape, these incredibly strong-hearted beings, like they are bringing so much medicine into that space. And when you stop and just notice them, get an ID book. I had like a ID book about New York, and like the weeds there, and was learning the weeds there. And I just would see them and like beam love to them and be like, thank you for existing. I'm so excited I can name who you are. And then they would just beam back at me. And it was one of the coolest experiences. And one of the things that I hear a lot from people in urban landscapes is like, oh, it's hard because I want to be able to harvest medicine and make tea and tincture, and I can't really in this space. But one of the things I do like to hand to people there is like, okay, it might not be that it's a clean enough place to harvest and, make a tincture, but it definitely is okay to make a flower essence. And because flower essences are so highly dilute, that you can make a flower essence pretty much anywhere in a city. And if you're truly concerned, maybe it's, something that you think has been sprayed with herbicide, you could always make a vibrational essence by just putting that bowl of water out underneath the flower and letting it sit for a few hours and asking for the energy to go into that water. But I find working with flower essences from city landscapes like so profoundly consciousness expanding and opening because like those flowers just bring so much energy and power and harmony to the landscape where they are and so much beauty. I mean, people are just in love with flowers that, you know, working with them in that way can really open up a lot, especially if you feel limited by taking like more, physical constituent based medicine from your environment. And, just in general, like anytime you want to work with a plant, bring them into your field in any way that you can. So even if the plant's not growing around you in that landscape, go see like, is there a botanical garden? You can go and visit that plant. Could you go to the library and, check out books where you get to look at really gorgeous photographs of that plant? Like any way in which you can bring that plant like into your field, you will be having a deep and profound interaction with that plant. They're going to be coming into your life. It may be, you may not see them growing on the street, but someone might hand you, a pamphlet and there's that plant on the cover of that pamphlet, and pay attention to those synchronicities because it's always possible to make these deep connections. And from my experience living in a place like New York City, it made my connection to the plants that much more precious and that much more potent.
I actually started studying herbalism in Detroit. And yeah, I think that everything that you have mentioned just feels like such a joyful connection too, right? To be in this urban environment and to be experiencing the joy of plants and plant connection in this space. And I loved your share about Datura because I remember the first time I ever saw blue vervain, it was growing in the cracks of a sidewalk in Detroit. And I was
Wow.
on the street and I was just like, there you are. And what a magical encounter that was. So thank
That's
you.
so cool. I don't think I've ever heard of blueberry rain growing out of a crack in the street. That's so neat.
Oh, I know. And that was even why it was more so like surprising because it isn't its, native habitat per se. Yeah, but it was blue vervain, it was Verbena hastata, and it was beautiful. So Asia, we are, migratory as humans, and obviously we have brought many a plant along on our journeys. How do you feel like ancestral land and the lineages that we have alongside plants inform the relationships that we build with them? And how do we honor those lineages and ancestral lines?
Hmm. Yeah, all of our ancestors were in deep relationship to plants, specific plants. Like they literally informed our DNA because these are the plants that our ancestors were eating. It's like so part of how your body manifests itself in this lifetime is due to the plants that your ancestors had a direct relationship with. I consider ancestral plant connection and wisdom to be like a deep taproot. Like it will stabilize you when you have it. And I think there's often like this sense, especially for those of us who are disconnected from the places in which our ancestors lived, that there's almost like a grasping like a vine sometimes, and I don't blame us for that because it's like we're trying to rebuild something, we're trying to rebuild this connection, and yet we are in a time right now actually where I feel like there's so many resources to reconnect to our ancestral wisdom and our ancestors and their connection with medicine. And so when we do that, what I find, and this is coming from my own experience of not feeling very connected at all to my ancestors for most of my time growing up, not having that be a part of my practice when I started practicing herbalism, and then afterwards starting to have it come in really strongly. I think in part of because I started connecting with the plants, that what I noticed is that when I cultivated this relationship with ancestral plant medicine and with my own ancestors, that it came in as this stabilizing and grounding force that helped me actually open up to like more wisdom and more connection exactly where I was. We don't have to become like an initiate in a lineage of ancestral plant medicine. It doesn't mean that we have to like move back to where our ancestors are from. That's not even accessible to most of us. But just learning, which plants your ancestors interacted with, which plants were important to them. You might actually know, which countries or places in the world you are from. Maybe you have done a DNA test and that's the information that you know. And so it's, maybe it's more general, but no matter what like lineage or line you can follow back, you can find and what were the plants that were growing there? What are the plants that are growing there? And, how can you connect to them now? And I noticed that, for example, when I did the first trip in a series of pilgrimage trips that I took to put my body back on the land that my ancestors were from in Europe, I arrived in Ireland. It was the first place I went. And I went from the airport to like sort of nearby where I was going to stay. Like I think the Airbnb wasn't ready or something. And I just was sort of like walking along this hedgerow and I was like looking around. And obviously I'd studied herbalism by this point. So I knew plants and new plant names and stuff. I'm looking around and I'm like, there's hawthorn, there's elder, there's nettle. And these are these plants that I had developed these relationships with, where I live in Western Appalachia, but that are native to this place that my ancestors are from. And it opened up like this whole new awareness for me around the plant's energy and around those plants' medicine. It was very cool. I don't think we need to go to these places. It's a privilege if we can, but I think even just interacting from that lens of, these are the plants that like literally built my DNA, that informed my ancestors' existence, that, when we connect in that way, it can open us up to so many other connections and to the deeper connections of where we actually are. Place-based relationships are really important. And so, where you grew up, where you live now, like you are going to have big, profound connections with those places, even if you are not indigenous to those places. And what I find is that when we have an ancestral plant connection and we have just ancestral connection in general, it literally gives us at greater access to the places that we're moving through now. It's almost like having an umbilicus where we then are like receiving the strength and the nourishment that we need to make connections where we are, connections that might not be ancestral connections, but might be connections of birth or places that really resonate with our soul. And, I know that, for example, like when I do land blessings here where I live in Western Appalachia, I ask for my ancestors to come and help bless this land where I live. And I noticed when I started doing that, like so much more energy came into those ceremonies and those rituals. And so I think the same is true for any way in which we are interacting with the plants and interacting with healing, that, bringing our own ancestral connection and knowledge and relationship in will just exponentially deepen exactly where we are and, who it is, the plants and the beings that we're connecting to.
I love how that message just connects us so much more to the places we're in and to the plants and to our ancestors, and recognizing the possibility of doing so even if we haven't been on the land for generations, like many of us haven't. So Asia, in your teachings, I would love to hear what practices you share with your students and, of course, in your own work that you feel most reliably deepen plant herbalist relationships.
hmm So I often say to my students, if you wanted to get to know a human better, what would you do? And, that is really like the guidepost for deepening your relationship with plants. And at its most basic, what does that look like? It's creating intimacy, intimate connection, spending quality time, spending time listening, witnessing someone in their growth. I think growing a plant is like the almost like I don't want to call it like a life hack because it's not a hack, but it's like it's the easiest way to get to know a plant like so deeply. And as I mentioned with, when talking about living in an urban landscape, it's okay if you don't even like see that plant all the way through, fruit or flower. You're still learning so much. So any way in which you can like physically be with a plant, to create that kind of intimacy, to, touch a plant, to taste a plant if that plant is edible, to make medicine out of a plant, like these almost like it's like those mundane things you do with other humans in your life that just build connection over time. Like that is the most reliable way to deepen your relationship with plants. And especially if you are in presence with a plant, if you are growing a plant or you have a plant growing around you, or maybe you only have access to that plant like in dried form, you're making tea or taking tincture, but to interact in a physical way, if possible, and then get quiet, like to actually just like stop talking then and listen, just listen and receive. I think that it just goes so far of having these like physical presencing with a plant and then like letting go of doing in that moment and listening. Like we really discount. Sometimes I think we feel like we need to have like 12 steps, or we need to like travel somewhere and have a very intense ceremony with a plant in order to get to know that plant. And that is just not true. Like literally just having some sort of daily connection ritual with a plant, whether you're eating that plant every day, you're sitting with that plant every day, you're journaling with that plant every day, you're taking a flower essence every day, like some sort of like practical movement of bringing that plant into your life every day, and then creating space to listen. And for me, writing is really helpful in this. And so, I often will have like a practice where I just sit, take that plant and just write for a few minutes and see what comes out. And so, to me, these sort of mundane daily connections with plants in the midst of making space to listen is really just the most reliable way to create deep relationship.
Beautiful. I love how it can be so simple, right?
Yeah.
So, one of the things that we see often is kind of the disdain that folks have for invasive species. I wonder how you approach them from a like relationship lens, and if you have any soul lessons that have come through that these invasive plants tend to carry.
Yeah, I think invasive plants carry a lot of messages for us and like um they're really potent to be connecting with at this period of time. So here's the thing is plants like they simply grow where there's space for them. They aren't demonic, they aren't problematic, they're just themselves. And the invasive plants exist where they do mostly because of us, because of humans. And so, what we do with invasive plants often, what I see in our culture, is that we project onto them all of our issues with ourselves. And so, all of the anger and guilt and shame that we feel about, the human species, ourselves as individuals, we end up projecting them onto these invasive plants who are really just growing where there's space to grow. That's their raison d'etre. That's how they exist. And I'm not saying this to say that we shouldn't nurture native communities or take steps to create better balance in our ecologies to invite back in more native ecosystems. But I do think that there's this soul level on which invasive plants come in to help us become of the invasive thought patterns that often rule our lives and we don't even realize it. And what's cool about recognizing these invasive thought patterns is that oftentimes these thought patterns, whatever they are, whether they have to do with anger or guilt or shame, these ideas that we have about ourselves that, we shouldn't be in a place that we don't belong, that, we're creating disharmony, whatever those thought patterns are, that when we work with those invasive thoughts, what we end up finding is medicine underneath them. It's not just like these invasive thoughts come up because we're just, doomed and like we have this annoying thing that we have to deal with, like these thoughts that come up like this for us again and again are actually trying to point us towards something that needs healing. It's trying to point us towards a truth that we need to recognize within ourselves. The truth is often buried under that invasive thought that is causing anxiety or causing disturbance. And so when we can be aware of the way in which we project onto invasive plants, we can then become aware of these invasive thought patterns that in many ways are like subconsciously ruling our world, right? And and obviously we know that many invasive plants come in with really big important medicine. Like these are abundant medicines for us, like where I live, Japanese knotweed is a huge invasive plant that like really chokes out a lot of the creeks where I live. And it was a really big problem in the creek here when I first moved in. And I had to really catch myself when I first moved into this place where I'd get in that creek and I just would be like getting so like angry and frustrated, with this plant. And then I'd literally have a moment where I'd be like, Asia, like this plant was instrumental to you helping to heal from Lyme disease. Like, and what's been very cool about witnessing sort of the spread of Japanese knotweed throughout this country is that the maps, if you overlay the maps of like the spread of Lyme disease and the spread of this invasive, they're very, very similar. And so I think there's just like there's so much medicine here for us actually and like abundance in that medicine. And so like on a physical level, harvesting these plants, working with these plants, eating these plants, but then also on that more spiritual level as well. They are really helping us to see and recognize the field of projection that we live inside of, all the ways in which these invasive thought patterns are coming up and are preventing us from actually having a deeper relationship with the world. And I really feel like when we address these invasive thought patterns, some of these like global patterns that we have of like disregard that is causing the spread of invasive species will just naturally dissolve. So there's a reason why they're there. And if we can embrace that they're here to help us, I think a lot will change.
There's so much potency to your message, Asia. I absolutely love that knowledge about Japanese knotweed, and I feel like this gives us so much more to think about in our relationships to invasive species. I will share just how much Mimosa, Albizia, Julie Breeson comes up for me when you were talking about this, idea of the invasive nature of our thoughts and the plants we find in our communities. And, Albizia being the tree of happiness or collective happiness bark, and just looking at this plant and its label as like a highly invasive, which is true, but also the fact of how much we need the medicine that comes from it. So we're going to wrap up, Asia, by offering our listeners one simple daily practice that they can use to attune to plants and why they should.
So this is again very simple, but I have found that it really opens up so much. And this is a 10-minute sit and listen session. So to choose a plant, and I like to work with plants for moon cycles. So to choose a plant for a whole moon cycle and do a 10-minute sit and listen session each day. So find a time of your day that works for you. Maybe, a time where you have the space to sit and listen. So it might be first thing in the morning, it might be in the evening, it might be during a lunch break. But to sit and preferably if you can be in presence with that plant. If you can't physically be in presence with that plant, maybe taking a bit of that plant's medicine or having a bit of that plant talismanically with you, like a leaf pressed or something like that. And just take 10 minutes to sit quietly and listen, to focus on your breath, to sink into your clairs, to be open to what it is that, you might be perceiving. I really like the breath in particular as a vehicle for moving into this because we literally breathe in the breath of plants, and they breathe in our breath. So even having that be a focal point of like, I'm breathing in literally the breath of this plant and I'm breathing out and having them breathe me in and sit. You can even set a timer, sit for 10 minutes, sit and listen. Know that when just through doing this, even if you're not receiving a message every day, that you're building trust. You're building trust in yourself, you're building trust in that relationship. And that oftentimes what I find is that there's actually like an arc inside of a relationship with a plant that it may not even be like just that one session, but what you're learning over the arc of this whole moon cycle of sits, like it will appear at the end of it. You'll see like the arc of what you've been working with or what you've been learning from this plant. And I really encourage you, if you can, at the end of this 10-minute sit and listen sessions, to just jot down whatever came through that day, because sometimes we'll think that we will remember each day and we don't. And so at the end of this, month-long cycle, to go back and look at what you've written and see that arc for yourself. See what is the overall message, or what is your relationship with this plant like. And I love this practice in particular because it's creating a daily way for us to commune. It's literally like rewiring our brain to think more animistically, to think more metaphorically, to be open to what happens during those 10 minutes, because it might be you have a thought, or it might be like something happens, in that moment. Maybe, an alarm goes off, or a leaf falls in your lap, or you have an idea about something else completely different. But when you think back on it, you're like, oh, that is such a metaphor for what actually I was asking in the session, that it's rewriting our brains. It's creating this built sense of trust. And then it's also giving us this sort of wider perspective on our life and showing us what's possible when um, we are in daily connection with plants, when we do really tend that relationship. So that is the 10-minute sit and listen sessions, and I encourage you to give it a try.
Thank you, Asia. I am absolutely awe-inspired by all of the wisdom that you hold within yourself and the teachings that you have offered us today. Please do let our audience know where they can find you out in the world, and any courses or classes or teachings or projects that you have upcoming you'd like to share about.
Yeah. So you can find me on my website, asiasuler.com. There's a lot of free resources on that website, including a quiz called What is Your Earth Healing Archetype? So I've seen really amazing breakthroughs happen for people when they take this quiz and access the completely free suite of classes that comes along with it to help you understand this archetype that you're embodying in your life. Like it gives people this perspective of how their energy works, how they're supposed to be using their energy in the world, like what the innate gifts are that they're bringing. These 5 archetypes came out of my own experiences of working in private practice for over a decade, and really seeing that they came up over and over again. And they're also in alignment with the Taoist concept of the 5 spirits. So it's a really like cool, interesting set of classes that's, again, totally free, and just a really great way to take that next step, tune into yourself, and stay in connection with me. So that is there. That's also where all my online classes are. I am on Instagram and Facebook under Asia Suler, and I also have a podcast called Remember Why You're Here. And so that podcast is streaming on all the podcast services. I have a book called Mirrors in the Earth. So if you're interested in sort of ecological lessons from the natural world that help you to understand your own journey, then that book is there. And yeah, coming up in March, we are going to be opening the doors again to this new school for sensitives called Earth Angel School. And so this school is like it's the collaboration, it's the collation of like really everything that I've been learning in my life in the last 15 years about how to be a sensitive person on this planet, like how to be a sensitive person in the wider ecology of this planet. And it feels so like profound for me because I am a sensitive person, and I notice that most of the people I work with are sensitives as well. And many of us are asking this question, whether we came into this through orienting to our nervous system, our sensitivity, or whether we came through a healing crisis, wanting to connect with the plants, that we often end up in this place of really wondering, like, what is my role here? Like, how am I meant to give back to this wider ecology? And so that's so much of what Earth Angel School is about. It's about really learning who you are in the wider ecology of the world, and in your relationship to this planet. So we launched this program last year. It was truly incredible. It's a live 3-month program, and we're about to open the doors again. We only open the doors once a year. So if you're sensitive and this is something that you're interested in, if you're, yeah, sensitive who loves working with plants and being connected with the earth, then I would love to journey with you there. And you can check out all that information over on my website.
That sounds so amazing, Asia. I will absolutely be looking into the Earth Angel School. I'm so
Mm.
grateful for you and your teachings and your time today. It's been an honor having you on, and thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be a part of this incredible collective and this amazing offering in the world. So thank you.